In this section of Chapter 1, we're going to talk about those theories of child development that encompass those items we talked about from the basics of child development, talking about nature versus nurture, continuity versus discontinuity, and then the basics of scientific research and the scientific method. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here is the theories that have a result, from those basics of child development. So there are a set of evolutionary theories, and these theories examine how humans adapt to the environment to survive. And there are three specific groups. There's ethology, evolutionary developmental psychology, and attachment theory, although attachment can kind of fit into two different categories because it also fits into the psychodynamic category. So here you have a photograph of Konrad Lorenz, and he coined the term imprinting. And this is based on his research in which he took baby ducks, and he had noticed that when baby animals hatch out of eggs, particularly birds, they focus the first living creature they see, they focus their attention on that individual, which tends to be their mother. But in this case, he did an experiment where he made sure that he was the individual, the first individual that these goslings saw. And they followed him around, and he tried to do the kinds of things that their mother would do in teaching them how to swim and how to eat and all of those things. And he called that process imprinting. With evolutionary theories and particularly ethology, what tends to happen is the beginning concept starts with animals, and then that approach is implemented in regards to human beings and tested to see if that works. And when we talk about attachment theory, even though it has its basis in psychodynamic theories, the research was actually done in the beginning focusing on cats and dogs and the relationship between puppies and kittens and their mothers. So with psychodynamic theories then, there are conflicting forces, and these impact early experience. And there are basically two psychodynamic theorists, and later we'll talk about the third one, which is Bowlby. Sigmund Freud was the original theorist, and he believed that the personality and identity had three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. And his theory is a discontinuous theory. It has steps and stages. So he has 5 stages of psychosexual development. Erikson built on Freud's ideas, and he focused on the social and emotional aspect of development plus societal expectations, and he focused more on the ego, whereas Freud focused on the id. So let's take a look at those 3 parts of personality and what they're all about. So here in this picture, or this slide, the issue is that there's some candy there. And so you can see on the left, the id wants the candy, and that's really the issue with personality. In the very beginning, when we're a newborn, the id is predominant and the only aspect of our personality there, and the id wants its needs met and focuses on getting those needs met or pleasure. And In this picture, it's the candy, the pleasure that this id wants. In preschool years, then the ego starts to show up. And that's the second part of the personality or identity. And the ego, with the ego, they realize that throwing tantrum, crying, and screaming is not an effective way for getting what you need or want. And so you can see that the id is focusing on a book that includes, if you look at the cover of the book, rational plans. So what can we do instead of throwing a tantrum? Well, we could try to look as cute as possible and say, please, 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 can I have candy? And that's an example of the ego at work. And then towards the end of preschool, the superego starts to show up, and this is where society starts making an impact on our personality with what society views as appropriate and inappropriate behavior. And so the question mark of the superego is it appropriate for us to have the candy right now, or is it inappropriate? And so those are the three parts. Keep in mind that Freud said the ego is the predominant one throughout our life, actually, whereas Erickson said, no, it's the ego that is influenced by society and the rational plans to function within society. So with Freud, here are his 5 stages of development, his discontinuous theory. And by the way, he believes that biology is the most important aspect, although he does definitely feel that environment does have an impact too. The first stage is oral for infants, and pleasure is found with the mouth and comfort, being hugged, sucking. Second stage is the anal stage for toddlers, and this is all about control and power. So it's power and doing things on their own. And toilet training is a major milestone for toddlers. It is a very empowering to be able to choose to use the toilet rather than the diaper, and not to have to depend on others to change your diaper and make you more comfortable. For preschoolers, it's the phallic stage, according to Freud, and they're interested in the ways, the parts of their body and how they work, and how their body differs from the bodies of others. And that's part of why in a preschool you'll see open, no doors on the bathrooms, this aspect, plus safety issues. Elementary school is the latency stage, and the concern is fitting in with others just like yourself. And part of it is you want to do, if you're male, what other males are doing, and female, what other females are doing. And so children tend to segregate by gender during elementary school. And then finally, adolescents and adults are all lumped together in one group, and the focus is, the name of the stage is genital, and it's all about identity and forming relationships with others. Okay, so that's Freud's idea about development. And remember, his theory focuses on nature, although he does believe that environment has an impact. And it is a discontinuous theory. It has stages. And we can compare it to ethology and Lorenz's theory. His is a continuous theory. There are no steps and stages. So here's Erikson's lifespan, and this is a big difference between Erikson and Freud. He doesn't lump adolescents and adults together. He has separate stages, and instead of starting at the top, this starts at the bottom and goes up. And so there are 3 stages for adults there at the top. At the bottom, though, is where we're going to look for infants in the first year. What you'll notice about Erikson's stages is there's a positive outcome and a negative outcome. And the ideal, of course, is to have that positive outcome. And that happens by the social interactions related to the ego, or those interactions with others around them. And so an infant will develop trust if the adults that care for them meet their needs consistently. And a toddler, or from 1 to 3, which is once they start walking, they're considered a toddler. Autonomy will develop if children are allowed to exert their independence and do things on their own. Initiative, and that's, by the way, related to Freud's anal stage, and trust versus mistrust is related to Freud's oral stage. And then initiative versus guilt. This is early childhood, preschool years, where if children trust their environment, they are allowed to be independent, then they're going to take initiative to do things that are creative and exploratory, and they're going to discover and do things independently. If they are not can't trust and they're not independent, they're going to feel they're not going to take initiative, or if they're taking initiative and the adults complain about how that affects them too much, they're going to feel guilty about that and stop taking initiative. The next stage is industry versus inferiority. And so if the child trusts their environment, if they're independent, if they take initiative, then when they reach elementary stage, they're going to be industrious. And if they haven't developed all those previous stages, it's going to be more difficult for them to meet the industry that's required in elementary school. And then you can take a look at the adult stages and see maybe where you fit there. And you can see how these build on each other, how they're related to Freud's ideas, and also that they're qualitatively different, these stages, than each other. So now let's take a look at Piaget's theory. His theory, rather than focusing on identity and personality and more social, emotional kinds of aspects of development, he focuses on cognition. And his theory describes and explains how children think, how they develop language and memory and other processes that change with development. And Piaget says that children actively construct knowledge. They organize what they learn into schemes or schemas, which are categories of knowledge. And we'll look more specifically at this as we go through the different developmental ages. And he has 4 stages of cognitive development. And again, his theory is discontinuous. And he believes that it's what has the most impact on development is nature or biological unfolding. And so you can see his 4 stages of development here. And we'll look in detail at each one of these as we go through the textbook. His first stage is sensory motor. So children's active exploring and discovery really focuses on using their senses, all of their senses, along with their developing motor skills. And this goes from birth to age 2. And then pre-operational stage is building on that sensory motor knowledge and developing language more, and developing, exploring the environment, discovering, and also discovering the relationships with other people. And this goes from ages 2 to 7. Keep in mind that this goes all the way to 2nd grade. The third one is concrete operations from ages 7 to 11, so from 2nd grade to 5th grade. And in this stage, they are more sophisticated in their thinking abilities, more abstract. They don't have to have real objects, three-dimensional depictions of real objects there in order to think and problem solve. And so they're beginning to be more abstract thinkers. And then the final stage is formal operations. And in sort of like Freud, Piaget has lumped adolescents and adults together. But there are distinct differences between formal operations and adolescents versus adults. And we'll talk about that more when we look at our 3 chapters on adolescence. Okay, so 4 stages of development that are discontinuous and focus on nature or biological unfolding. Vygotsky, his theory is also basically focused on cognition, but he has a little bit different focus than Piaget. They often argued about what has most impact on cognitive development because they were developing their theories at the same time. Vygotsky felt that history, culture, and language are important factors in cognitive development, and that learning takes place in social contexts where more expert members of society interact with children. And so Piaget felt that we really can't influence or speed up development. All we can do is provide the perfect environment for development to happen, whereas Vygotsky disagreed. He believed that we could accelerate development. And so he says we can do that. Vygotsky says we can do that by finding the zone of proximal development. And the zone of proximal development is the area in between what a child can do on their own and then what they can accomplish if we were to help them. And so, for example, when a child is moving towards learning to walk, that's not just 1 minute they can't walk and the next minute they can. There are several skills they have to develop before they can walk. And so if we notice that a child is starting to pull themselves up to stand, that's one of the steps towards walking. And so we know what comes next, and we have to keep in mind that what comes next is not walking, but something called cruising, where the child moves their feet as they hold on to furniture until they can strengthen their legs and become more steady. And this is a zone of proximal development where we can speed up that development if we set up an environment and support them in walking along the furniture, hanging on to the furniture. And that's an example of using Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And what we're doing to facilitate and support that development is called scaffolding. Okay, so even though we don't talk about steps and stages for Vygotsky, That's something that if you were to go to graduate school, you would study, because his steps and stages are very similar to Piaget's, but he is a discontinuous theorist as well. Now let's focus in on the continuous theories that tend to focus more on the environment, and they don't have steps and stages. And so here's a picture of Skinner, and Skinner is developed something called operant conditioning. And so we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So learning theories focus on the role of environment in explaining development. And so these theorists believe that nurture is more important than nature. Classical conditioning has to do with responding to stimulus. And so, for example, if a child, an infant, expects to be fed or having a diaper change, if that's happening a lot, then they're going to, whenever that the individual that does that appears, they're going to expect and respond in that way. They're going to look for food, or they're going to focus on getting ready to have their diaper changed. That's called classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is focusing on the behavior that we want and then reinforcing that behavior. And we're going to talk in a minute about two different types of reinforcement. And then building on those different conditioning, then there is the social learning theory, which, by the way, the theorist is Bandura, where we don't just respond to stimulus or reinforcement, but we watch other people and what they're doing, we see what happens to them, and then we imitate which behavior we want to copy. And that's social learning theory. And so here, let's talk about operant conditioning and reinforcement versus punishment. Since most of us are very familiar with punishment, let's talk about that one first. Punishment focuses on inappropriate behavior, and really Skinner says that this is the least effective way to change behavior, and punishment works best if we use it very sparingly and rarely. And when we punish, we take away something a person likes, like their favorite TV show, when they behave inappropriately. Or we might add something that a person does not like make them do the dishes for the whole week. If they don't like doing the dishes, that would be a punishment. Whereas reinforcement, which is what operant conditioning does, focuses on the desired appropriate behavior, and this is the most effective way to change behavior. And so with positive reinforcement, you look for the behavior you want, and then you add something the person likes. So if you're working on encouraging a child to share, whenever you see them sharing, then you can add something they like, such as a hug, if they like hugs. That's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment, and sometimes people get that confused. Negative reinforcement is taking away something a person does not like when they behave appropriately. So if a child shares, and that's the appropriate behavior you want to reinforce, you could use negative reinforcement by picking up their toys for them if they don't like picking up their toys. So, and you would tell them, because you shared today with your brother, I'm going to pick up your toys for you. So that is an example of how reinforcement and punishment differ. And remember, reinforcement is the most effective way to change behavior, where punishment is the least effective way and should be used rarely. So other continuous theories that focus on nurture would be information processing theories that look at cognitive development and our human brain as being analogous to a computer. And then there are also developmental cognitive neuroscience theories that use physical tools to assess development and focuses on how the brain changes related to behavior and cognitive changes. And here's an aspect of information processing. When you enter things into the computer, you have to save them. And so that's the same with our memory. So a sensory memory is the initial processing of stimuli. It's very selective because we may pay attention to it, we may not, and it only lasts for a few seconds. And there is a type of sensory memory for all of our senses: sight, sound. And so, for example, when you go to the grocery store, there is always music playing, but you may not you may not notice that it's playing, and so you're not going to remember what music is playing. But if you hear some music, like your favorite song, you're more likely to pay attention to that, and then you're going to remember it. And if that song is played in a different format, then you're more likely to remember it for a longer period of time in your sensory memory. And you're going to be thinking about that. It's going to move to your working memory. And this interfaces for combining new information with your long-term memory for active processing. So it's your favorite song, so you remember the words and how it sounds. But if you hear it in a different format, like if it's usually a heavy metal song, but somebody sings it with hip-hop format, then you're more likely to remember that. And so you might try it out yourself, rehearse it. So repeat the information in your working memory to make it activate it to last longer. And so you might practice doing it in the hip-hop format. You might also elaborate and rehearse it, connect this new with old information to hold on to it longer. And so you're connecting your favorite version to this newer version. And if you are focusing on that newer version is more likely to go into your long-term memory so that you can share that information with somebody else. So that's information processing theory's computer model, which is a continuous theory focused on nurture. So developmental systems theory is also focusing on nurture, and it has to do with continuous. And these are, development is influenced by components that interact over time. And Bronfenbrenner has the most elaborate bioecological model. Developing child is influenced by a layer of systems. And then there's dynamic systems theory that talks about the interplay of lots of different systems. And let's take a look at Bronfenbrenner's version of systems theory or ecological theory. And in this model, you can see the child is in the center of these nested circles, and it pays attention to the gender, the age, the health of the child. And then you have another layer which includes the family, school, friends, the neighborhood, and then a layer of friends of family, social services within the neighborhood, and then another that has to do with culture. And then the bottom you can see time also influences that system. So that's Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory.